Hello and welcome to the latest episode of ACM's Vault of Cult, the show where I pick a movie from the 80s or 90s that I've grown up loving that didn't do quite so well either critically, commercially or both. And this week's show I talk about Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, a movie from 1986, 13 years after the original horror classic. This movie is not considered so much of a classic, lighter in tone than the original, far more gore and more of a comedy, or in fact a comedy. The original wasn't at all amusing. The original is a dark, gritty horror masterpiece that many people love and consider one of the best horror films ever made. I agree with that, but I also, for many different reasons, really enjoy this sequel as well. I'm going to show it to a couple of people who haven't seen it before. Will they like it as much as me, or will they go the way of the general public? We just watched the movie, and this is the conversation we had about it afterwards. Okay, we've just watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. I'm joined by Antonia and Adam. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. You're both, I consider you both pretty big film fans, yeah?
I'd say so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a pretty big horror film fan, and film lecturer, so yeah.
So, yeah, I'm sort of assuming you've both seen the original Texas Chainsaw.
That's correct.
Yeah, absolutely, several times.
Yeah, would you consider yourselves fans of it?
I personally wouldn't. I think it's a well-made film. I've seen it once, possibly twice. I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to see it again.
Yeah.
But I do like it. I wouldn't say I'm a big fan of it, though.
I understand that, but would you consider it a classic horror?
I would, absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Like, I think it just doesn't let up, the first film. Like, it's pretty relentless in its approach, and I think it's an impressive film for such a low-budget film. I think the location does a lot of that. Does a lot of the work. How grotty the house is in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and how absolutely filthy it looks. Or there's a chicken feathers and chicken shit around. So yeah, no, I find the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre a really impressive piece of work, even though, like, I wouldn't say it's always an enjoyable watch, but it's a really well done horror film.
Yeah. So I've said that because obviously we're going to have to compare the two films throughout while talking about this. But neither of you'd seen it before. Was there any particular reason for that? Had you avoided it?
Yeah, maybe a little. I knew it was a horror comedy, and I do love some horror comedies, like Peter Jackson's Brain Dead, really big fan of. But I did wonder if this would sort of diminish the first film, and I know that Tobe Hooper's other films often aren't, apart from Poltergeist, which I know some people say Spielberg directed, aren't necessarily, like, I've seen Life Force and wasn't particularly keen on it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's partly why. What about you, Antonia?
Oh yeah, for me, this is 1986, I believe, and I think it's around the era that sequels were expected to be kind of poor and, less well made and less interesting sort of impressions of the first film, so I didn't necessarily think it'd be worth watching. Yeah, I
totally understand that. And Adam mentioned Life Force, which is kind of a cult film. A lot of people like that, but I think is possibly Tobe Hooper's weakest, at least cinema release movie. And yeah, in 1986 when this came out, it was heavy on Child's Play sequels, maybe, and definitely the Nightmare on Elm Street, and it's kind of like it was jumping on the bandwagon, I think, of Friday the 13th, all that sort of thing. I said Child's Play, that might have actually been after this, but it was that era of kind of character horror, could you say? You've got the Hellraiser, you've got Pinhead, you've got Freddy Krueger. So I think I always thought that
celebrity
that's it,
horror stars.
Yeah, and like trying to build a franchise. Yeah. And actually, the only horror sequel I really like is Halloween 3, which obviously is the one that doesn't have Michael Myers and is really a completely standalone film.
Yeah. I'm a fan of these sort of films, but the second ones, I always think, are kind of the poorest. If you look at Halloween 2, Nightmare on Elm Street 2, it's kind of quirky but not as good, and I can't even remember Friday the 13th Part 2. But with this, it got terrible reviews. I mean, I didn't see it until I must have seen it about 20 years ago. It got released in 2001. I always thought it got an earlier release, but possibly I saw a bootleg, which would have been around the time the original one properly got released, because that was banned for many, many years. And a lot of films were released late 90s, early 2000s, this along with The Exorcist, which finally got a proper release. I think some got initial releases when they came out, then never made it to video, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Got tied in with the sort of video nasty kind of films, which just the name Texas Chainsaw Massacre is off-putting to a lot of people. And with this being a bit of a comedy, it's obviously dark and obviously not to everybody's sense of humour, would you say? So kind of hard to sell, I'd say, to be mainstream.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Like, it's not a quirky horror comedy like, I don't know, Beetlejuice, for instance, clearly, but then it's not a terribly scary film.
It's more of a gross-out comedy, really.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
So a lot of the humour relies on cringe and squeamishness.
Yeah.
And terrible puns.
Yeah. But that was obviously you both kind of avoided over the years. So thanks for watching it. That's I appreciate that, because it is a kind of thing of films that I've grown up liking, and this is one I generally remember watching when I was young. I didn't think I'd like it, and I strangely do. And it has over the years built up a cult status. Hence, it's got a fancy sort of triple disc release, and people still talk about it. But shall we sort of analyse it, so to speak, starting with what there is of a plot? What did you guys think of that?
I mean, it ambles along a bit. It takes a while. I mean, obviously, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre has a very straightforward plot. I mean, you get a kind of recap at the start, the pre-credit sequence, and then...
Yeah, it seems to rely a lot on kind of exposition and recaps. You're told of a lot of action that you don't actually see on screen, and you're informed by Dennis Hopper's character that these people have been around, and there've been lots of killings that you haven't seen.
Yeah, so and it heavily relies on seeing the first movie as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you haven't seen that, the film won't make much sense. But it's so different to the first movie that I think this is why a lot of people couldn't get on with it.
Yeah.
But it's much less sort of grimy looking in the aesthetic.
Yeah.
I guess that shift from kind of 70s to 80s
horror,
right? That it's much more of a kind of phantasmagoric, kind of gross-out funhouse ride. It's a much messier film, I'd say, certainly in terms of plotting. The first film was very tight, whereas this is a bit all over the place. We have quite a lot of different locations, and there are bits where we're just sort of moving between scenes. Like, I wonder if you could have edited it down a little bit, but then maybe it would have been completely incoherent.
Yeah, I mean, all over the place definitely sums it up, and parts of it just don't seem to make sense at all.
No, it's difficult to understand why people have made the decisions they've made. Like Dennis Hopper's character, in many sequences, seems quite incoherent himself.
Yeah, but we'll talk about Dennis Hopper actually, because I'm not sure this was around the same time as Blue Velvet, which sort of. Almost a comeback role for him, wasn't it? In that after sort of the late 60s, early 70s performances, and it kind of you described it a bit of it, Adam, during it. He goes a bit like Nicolas Cage, doesn't he? A bit sort of crazy.
It's quite gonzo.
Yeah, and the character to me, he's a relation to one of the murdered characters in the first film, who's a policeman, and he just seems adamant that he's going to. He seems to know more about this family than everybody else, and doesn't really explain that either. And he's basically trying to get revenge for his family.
Yeah, I mean, he has a strangely difficult time persuading the other cops that there's a chainsaw involved in these recent murders, despite very little other obvious explanation.
Yeah, and they seem really casual about it, and
very dismissive.
The rest of the police force disappear after about 20 minutes of the film as well, and it's just him. He has. He doesn't even try to get any backup from any other police.
No, he's not in it for the backup. He's in it for personal revenge and a lot of chainsaw action.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing I find hilarious about it is he's after the chainsaw killers, and he goes to a shop and buys a load of chainsaws. Well, wouldn't he just buy a gun if he wanted to sort of end them?
Yeah, I guess he's sort of meeting them where they're at, on their own terms. He's a man of honour. Yeah,
but I mean, I find his character quite fun, but there's not really much going on there.
Not really. No, he's got that sort of steely-eyed intensity.
Yeah, and when you look at the performances, when you look at later roles, even in Waterworld where he's the villain, there's more to him. And do you think it was just a paycheck for him?
It does feel a bit like that. I mean, it feels like he might be channeling some, personal rage and things,
against trees or
bits of wood, but. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel like, supposedly with Blue Velvet, he, after reading the screenplay, phoned up David Lynch and said, I must have the role I am, Frank, which is terrifying, frankly. Clearly it was a passion project of sorts for him, whereas I don't really get that sense here.
No, I feel they needed a name to sell the film as well, which is something the original didn't have, and there's only one returning cast member, the chap who plays the cook in this, who I think the character's called the cook, but I think he's just called the man in the first one.
He does have an actual name in this one. He is Drayton Sawyer.
Okay, yeah, they do give the family name, don't they? Yeah, he's credited on IMDb as the cook though, which is strange. But they do give the family a name, and another family member's appeared, and that's played by Bill Moseley and Chop Top, who is we seem to think that he had been in Vietnam. That's why he's not in the first film.
Yeah,
that's not explained. And
no, it strongly suggests he was in Vietnam, because I think that's where he got his head plate.
Yeah,
from his skull.
And he mentions like Nam flashbacks and things. So it feels like there's a really kind of loose commentary on PTSD and it's any kind of satire in this film is very fast and loose. Like, it doesn't feel to me like it's making a super coherent statement. If you compare this to like a George A. Romero film, like certainly like Dawn of the Dead or Dare the Dead, which feel like they're sometimes like simple but very focused in the kind of satirical commentary. This definitely feels like it's sort of taking pot shots all over the place, and some of the satire kind of lands and a lot of it doesn't really. Like, it spreads itself quite thin, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean it's. The first one has a lot to say, really, hasn't it? Whereas this just seems, to me, I've always thought that the reputation of the first one, with the title Texas Chainsaw Massacre and being banned and all this, people who hadn't seen it would think it was this gory, chopping everyone up with a chainsaw mad film, and that's kind of what they've made with this.
It's
a bit like Driller Killer in that respect.
Yeah,
which is kind of plotless, really, and drilling and killing.
yeah. And that's a film I think I mentioned in one of the other podcasts that I just can't. I love a video nasty, a dodgy old horror, but Driller Killer, I can't get through it. I'll have to retry, I think, but there's probably other stuff to watch. But yeah, that's sold on the name, isn't it? And the artwork and stuff, which for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original one, you had the poster. Well, it just looked pretty menacing, didn't it?
Yeah, and then the poster for this film, which I do remember from childhood, is really goofy, right?
Yeah, it's the characters spoofing the famous poster from the Breakfast Club, which came out a year before this, so makes sense. And it's a very 80s film. I mean, it starts off, they go after what was kind of called yuppies, isn't it, at the time? And I think that's a jump from, in the original film, it's hippies. So
yeah, that's true.
It's commenting on what the almost fashion at the time.
And they're driving to Dallas or something.
Yeah.
So you've immediately got, this isn't just out in the sticks like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I find it quite startling that we suddenly got this sort of more urban location near the start, because that's so different to the first film.
And that's the thing with a lot of horrors, like I mentioned, Halloween 2, is kind of a rehash of the first movie, and for me doesn't work. Whereas with this, it's got the same characters and obviously chainsaw, but it's a completely different film. Do you think it's too big a jump?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, personally, I think it could have been its own different film. Like, I feel like the relationship with the first one does feel a bit arbitrary at times. Like, so, I know the first film I often read as sort of about, the Rust Belt and the end of blue-collar work in America, and people have read it as sort of, pro-vegetarianism film and things like that. And then you get glimpses of this kind of stuff in this film. But I say it's very kind of very pot shots.
Yeah. And it's difficult to watch it without comparing it to the first film, as we say. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the later ones, but this stands out to me as just something a bit different. And it's so many horror films try to recreate, but I think you're right. It is too different. Even like the if we talk about the character of Leatherface in this, in the first one, he just is a complete psychopath and wants to kill everybody.
Whereas in this one, he's almost like a Quasimodo type character.
Yeah, it's it should almost be called Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2: Leatherface in Love.
Pretty much.
Because
Yeah.
he falls for the main protagonist, who and she plays on that as well to save herself a couple of times. But I get there's got to be character development, but possibly too much change in Leatherface.
Yeah, because he's one of the scariest aspects of the first film, because he seems a bit like... I guess it's like with, Michael Myers or Jason, that, once you start over kind of psychologising these characters, almost takes away from their kind of elemental kind of power. Once you start diagnosing Michael Myers, he's not that scary anymore.
No, he loses the sort of menacing mystique.
Yeah, and same with Leatherface. In the first film, Leatherface is just this sort of force of brute violence, basically. He does, and he's this sort of shambling kind of figure, but the blankness is part of what makes him quite scary, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually write this down, but the setting and this whole kind of plot line with effectively a disabled character falling in love with one of the protagonists, or establishing friendship and protecting them from the rest of his family, reminded me a lot of the Goonies. This is kind of like the Goonies with much more gore.
It is weird how it does have these quite almost sentimental aspects to it, which does make for a pretty queasy mix of the exploitation, because it seems to it's sort of on a dime where there's a fair amount of Leatherface gyrating his hips, and the chaser was a big phallic extension. But then there are times where it does seem like pure love, Leatherface genuinely cares.
Which is interesting, right, because he spent his whole life, cutting people up and eating them.
Yeah.
So to him, it would be like the equivalent of a human falling in love with a pig. Because
I guess so.
Just the food stuff to him.
I mean, there is a hint that, he's seeing her more like a pet or something, like cute. He tethers her, and it does seem like he wants to sort of keep her. And that makes a bit more sense in terms of, if he's seeing other humans as just like, people would say chickens. But, it does feel a bit inconsistent. And he is played very oddly. You get quite a lot of, because he's meant to be... It's hard to say whether he's meant to be developmentally disabled. It's not like the film's very nuanced about this, but that's generally the impression you get of Leatherface. But then there are lots of very kind of, sort of nuanced facial expressions that, seem to express a sort of degree of irony, and, there are quite a few reaction shots of Leatherface where, he almost looks like, he's doing sort of Larry Sanders, or Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry Davis kind of expression or something.
Hand gestures and things.
Yeah, I mean, it's the camera goes to him a lot to try to get laughs, I think.
Yeah, especially when he's doing certain movements, pelvic thrusting with the chainsaw.
Yeah, that's a scene was mentioned quite a bit when early on they break into the radio studio, and there's a kind of strange scene.
It's like an erotic scene, almost.
With a chainsaw representing his penis, basically.
Which he then can't get started.
Yeah, which I assume, being the 80s, this was meant to be an hilarious scene. It is, but probably for different reasons.
Yeah, it's hard to say how it's being played.
Yeah.
I can see why the censors objected to it. It is definitely a sort of sexualised violence, but then it's so kind of literal and kind of heavy-handed. It's not really, it kind of is disturbing, but it's also so stupid.
It doesn't take it seriously in any way.
Yeah, I think that's what. Well, how this gets away with a lot, I think, is because it is so dumb and almost non-realistic, whereas the first one's the complete opposite. So I think, there's a fair bit of gore in this film. Not compared to, say, maybe The Evil Dead and that sort of thing, but there is a lot of gore in it.
Yeah.
The opening scene, they basically chainsaw the top of someone's head. It looks very 80s, very splatter type. So, it's. I think if something looks ridiculous, it does take away from the menacingness of it almost.
Absolutely, I think the special effects being so cheap, it's a bit like The Young Ones or something. It's impossible to be scared or worried by it, and it just makes you laugh. Yeah.
And did Tom Savini work on this?
He did, yeah.
Because it's not his best work, I have to say.
It's not, but apparently he's very proud of the grandpa at the end. He considers that some of his finest work.
Okay.
Which, after reading that, I did the sort of double. And that does look good. They've obviously spent a lot of time on that. But it's not really a horror effect, is it? They've just made someone look old and a bit sort of menacing. They've made the nose look bigger, and it almost looks like a better budget. Remember Harry Enfield, the old Gits?
Oh yeah.
It kind of looks a bit like that. But and this is it's not early in his career either, is it?
No, not at all. This must be after, say, Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah, mid 80s. But the budget was something they had problems with, being a Cannon film where they just sort of threw money at projects. They had a set budget, and just before shooting they took $1 million away. And that comes from what Cannon would do was it all depends on how successful their latest releases were. So they invested a lot, but if their last film didn't do so well, they'd just cut budget. Around that time they're probably relying on films like Chuck Norris films, that sort of thing. Over the Top from Stallone was around the same time, and that didn't do very well at all. And it was only a year later they released Master of the Universe and Superman 4, which destroyed them.
Okay.
Two films that they were banking on. And looking back at that period, it's hard to see how those films didn't make money, but times changed kind of quickly, and sort of He-Man, the cartoon, and toys were sort of 3-4 years before that. The kids had maybe grown up, and Superman 4, well, frankly, wasn't very good, and it was the fourth in a series where the other three were considerably better. So I think they were trying to sell films on their names, and that's the reason this film got made. They went in with the script, Tobe Hooper, and the other guy who produced it, L.M. Kit Carson is his name, and he wrote Paris, Texas, big producer.
Yeah.
They apparently 5 lines of the screenplay, and Cannon was sold and said they'd make it. It doesn't look overly cheap to me, and when you consider the film's 36 years old, 36 years old. So no, I'm completely wrong. It's made in 86, wasn't it? So 34 years old.
Yeah, there's a lot thrown into the set design. So, it's spent on art direction and such. I'm not sure to what end sometimes. Like you were saying, Phil Antonia, that a lot of it doesn't really make sense in terms of how much they've decked out their new hideout.
Absolutely, one of the more sort of strong impressions of the first film was the bleakness of their dwelling. Really did feel like they were scratching together an existence. In this film, they have quite a palatial setup. They're living in an abandoned theme park. There are lamps, and it's lit up like.
It's like a Scooby-Doo.
It's like Blackpool Illuminations. And it must have taken because the film kind of meanders a fair bit. You've got time to sit and think. And I was looking at them running through their, the tunnels of their home, and these hundreds of lamps, and just thinking, well, did they go to charity shops to pick up these lamps, and how long did it take them to string all these lights up and put bulbs in these chandeliers, and they also have an entire room full of spare bulbs. And a film shouldn't let me think. It should keep me much more occupied. So
I think the pacing of the film is strange, because I think the first sort of third of it goes along at a decent pace. and the scene where they're in the radio studios, kind of memorable. Don't want to use the word fun, but there's a few jumps in there as well, and it's well made, and it's like towards the end of the film it doesn't really know where it wants to go.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
It does seem to end quite suddenly as well.
Yeah, I mean it really does. I don't know if that was a budget thing and they just done what they could, but I think it's a strange thing because this film could have been fairly big. I mean, it had 13 years after the first, and the film, if anything, grew in popularity over the years. And it had got, early 80s when videos came in, the first film would have done really well, even if it's just on the black market copies of it. And that's probably how this got made. Tobe Hooper definitely wanted another hit. And you mentioned Poltergeist, so that was a huge hit, but it is strongly rumoured that he didn't even properly direct it. Produced by Spielberg, and wasn't there some sort of strike or some reason?
Well, there's a clause in Spielberg's E.T. contract that he wasn't to direct another film while working on E.T.
Okay.
So that's possibly
the
reason. But it certainly films a lot more like a Spielberg film than any.
It doesn't feel like a Tobe Hooper film, does it? I mean, he'd done between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and this Funhouse, Shalom's Lot. He'd done a TV series, miniseries
of course.
Eaten Alive, which is quite a grim film.
So is that like a Killer Croc film or something?
Yeah,
Alligator.
Yeah. And then he did do Invaders from Mars. That was for Canon, I believe, and I think that might have been. I think he might have had a free movie deal with them.
Okay.
Well, so we got Life Force, Invaders from Mars, and I think they wanted a hit, so they were like, let's do Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But it was 4.7 million budget, and it only made 8 million, so not really a hit, is it? But I think it was only cinema released in America, it definitely didn't get cinema release over here. So with a film like that, it's kind of a strange one. It's like they've tried to make a commercial success of a film, but put so many things in it to put people off going to see it.
Yeah.
So I can see why it's. I mean, I like it because of almost. I don't want to say naffness of it, but it's cheesy and fun. And I do really like the first one. I know it's a difficult watch, but I like it because it's a good film, well made, and generally scared me when I first saw it. And then the scenes in the original of the screaming and shots onto people's eyeballs is like, even now I don't think I've seen a horror film that is anything like it.
Not in terms of intensity, it's pretty astonishing, the first film. And I think what's amazing about it is I remember thinking or remembering it as a really gory film and rewatching it, and then there's so little gore in it, and how much work the sound design and the location doing that film is astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason you remember there being a lot of gore is because the gore that there is gives such a lasting impression. Can we talk about the dinner scene? In
the first film, or the reprise?
Both.
In this? Okay,
yeah. Obviously, in the first film, I think the dinner scene is a scene that stays with you for a long time.
Yeah, it's a very upsetting scene.
Yeah, and they make an attempt at a reprise of that.
Yeah, so they bring back Grandad,
who was 137 years old.
Yeah. So in the first film, there's a real horror in him. He's meant to have been the butcher, and now he's decrepit and he can barely raise the hammer, and so it takes him an agonisingly long time to bring the hammer down. And it's and they sort of play up to this again. This film, it doesn't have nearly the same effect.
No, it's not so horrifying. It does seem more comedic than funny.
I think they've just sort of thrown it in because of the first one, and there are memorable scenes in this film, but that isn't one of them.
No, it does feel like a wasted opportunity, really, and the fact they give him the hammer again and try to recreate the scene feels quite cheap. I have noted down that perhaps eating human flesh is a secret to long life.
Yeah.
It could be a plausible alternative to drinking Guinness or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I find the whole Grandad still being alive quite ridiculous when you look at the original film. But I've separated this from. It's almost, I don't want to say a spoof of the original one, but it's almost like it's a sequel but made in a different universe.
Yeah, I see that, though it doesn't quite. I mean, obviously, it's not doing anything quite as, I guess, sophisticated as, say, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, right, or Scream. Like, it's not a straight parody, and it's not doing this sort of meta. Obviously, like with New Nightmare, the idea being that Kruger's have crossed over into our world, and Wes Craven himself is in the film. You don't get anything. That's the odd thing about this film, is that, like, on some level it feels like it is being a spoof or a parody, and on another level it feels like it's trying to create a gross out film. On another level it feels like it's trying to be a really gory horror film. Like, it does have a lot going on, and I'm not wholly convinced it all hangs together.
Well, Tobe Hooper was adamant that the first one was supposed to be funny, and because of the it was different and so dark, he thought people missed the humour, so he tried it more with this. I find that hard to believe, really. I mean, there's like with all films, there's a bit of, there is a little bit of humour in the first one, but I think maybe if it wasn't meant to be funny, that he's the one who missed it, not the audience.
Yeah, I think you'd have to be like really misanthropic, like properly nihilistic, I think, to really find that first film funny.
Yeah.
There are elements, but I can't really imagine chuckling my way through it, to be honest.
No, it's too grim, Just the way it's shot doesn't really work for humour. Whereas with this is such an 80s looking film, and it's very brightly lit as well. I mean, in the underground bit, you mentioned there was all the lamps. I mean, to be really menacing, you wouldn't have had that.
The lights everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, lamps are quite cosy.
Yeah.
Not going to intimidate somebody with a standard lamp.
No. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of. I mean, this is one I would like to have seen in the cinema, because it looks quite cool, I think, but not necessarily for a scary film. But you mentioned Goonies. It has that feel. There's lots of skeletons in it, and it's almost like it's trying to fit into the mould of a 80s hit.
Yeah, or like Big Trouble in Little China, maybe, or so, I don't know. Like, it's got this sort of action adventure look to it.
Yeah, like Indiana Jones. Do you think they're trying to make an 80s film or a Texas Chainsaw film?
I think they're trying to sell the Texas Chainsaw name to an 80s audience and make money at the same time. And that's weirdly, that's kind of why I like it, because it's this. It is I don't like using the word fun for something this violent, but it is. And the fact that there's a chainsaw kind of sword fight at the end is ridiculous. You wouldn't have got that in the first film.
Yeah, it's a bit like something from Zorro or one of the Wild West movies, jumping on tables and things.
Yeah, and we've had Indiana Jones, which is a big hit, and it's that sort of hero fighting. There's no hero really in the first film, whereas in this you've got two, because you've got the DJ character, Stretch, isn't it? And Dennis Hopper, and in these horror films you have the female lead. In this, she's kind of stronger than a lot of them. There's no female deaths in this either, which they deliberately done because of the Nightmare on Elm Street and Babysitter. I mean, that's kind of quite cool, I think, that they done that. But what do you think of the female lead? Does the character work? Because you mentioned the decisions she makes.
Yeah, she makes some silly decisions, but to be fair, they all do.
Yeah.
I do think the character really works. I like the actress as well. She makes some excellent expressions. Really quite funny to watch. Quite entertaining. We actually rewound a bit because there's a scene where Leatherface is kind of pelvic thrusting towards her with a chainsaw, and she makes the best appalled expression I've ever seen in a film, so I had to rewind that to have a good laugh.
But I haven't seen her in much else. It's Caroline Williams, and she kind of made a career kind of off this film. Lots of cameos and playing DJs in other films, that sort of thing. And she's in the third one as a reporter, as a sort of reference to this. And I think she does a lot of the Comic-Cons and that sort of thing. And the cast, Dennis Hopper aside, seem to have really liked the film. But Bill Moseley's gone on to be an almost horror icon, and he still refers to the role, not necessarily the film, but the role as one of his favourites, if not his favourite. And he kind of redoes the same thing in the Devil's Reject, the Rob Zombie films, which are, we say, tributes or rip-offs to these movies.
Yeah.
But I think one of the strongest things about this film is the Stretch character.
Yeah. And you do get the sense that they probably had fun making this film, which clearly wasn't the case of the first film. Although that is what partly gives the first film its menace, is you can tell it was a gruelling shoot. Everyone looks really strung out, and the set looks horrible, and it looks really hot and oppressive. Whereas I imagine there was a fair amount of laughter making this film, you know. Yeah. But that's not necessarily. It definitely is a weirdly fun film in a lot of ways, even though I don't think it's a terribly funny film. Like, it definitely hasn't got loads of great jokes in the way something like Brain Dead has a very high joke ratio. Like, and Tony, you were saying this relies more just on gross out than necessarily jokes.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really laughs in it. Three of us sat here watching it. We laughed at a few of the reactions and that sort of thing, but there's no. It's more the way the characters behave opposed to joke humour, isn't it?
Yeah, there aren't really sort of joke structures.
There are certain films that feel like they are there for you to make jokes about.
Yeah.
We did laugh at them, but it was mostly our own comments.
Yeah, but it's definitely. Well, you're meant to laugh at it, so in that respect it works. There was a story about the one of the preview screenings. And the people from Cannon were fuming because people were laughing at it. But it was the co-writer said, well, they obviously didn't read the script then, because you can't take that seriously. And on that respect, I think it does work. But this has got more of a Saturday night drive-in feel to it as a movie, opposed to the original. It's kind of almost arty, the original.
Yeah, it does. It does feel a bit more like with Night of the Living Dead, which was originally intended as a sort of art housey, avant-garde film. Like, I mean, I think I definitely I struggle with some of Wes Craven's films, for instance, because they really do feel really prurient and like they're quite aggressive in their sexualization of the kind of supposed teenage characters and things. Like, there's some really queasy stuff even in the first Nightmare on Elm Street, and I find like Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warrior, is really odd in the way that on one level it's like a kind of kids adventure action film, and then there's still some really nasty stuff. And actually it's interesting looking briefly at that booklet with the BBFC's comments, and people saying talking about some misogynist elements, but it didn't really. I can see why people might be a bit troubled by that scene with Leatherface, but I didn't find it really skeezy, to be honest.
No, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah. I think compared to a lot of other horror films of the period.
Yeah, it holds up quite well, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be said that this is almost spoofing other, not so much Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but other films of the period. I see it personally more as trying to fit in. It seems like that when you look at a lot of films from that era, they're basically all about sex, aren't they? Whereas with that scene, the fact that it is a chainsaw, and I mean, if this was the original, made in 1986, I think there'd be a lot of that going on. And so that's kind of one of the weird elements about the film, I think. And I think weird is a word I use a lot for this, because this is the thing, does the film work, do you think?
I mean, I don't really think it does, personally. I found it more of a curio. I mean, there are definitely things to recommend it. It's certainly not unwatchable by any means, and it's not boring or dreary. Like, if you compare it to some, like you were saying that often you don't like second sequels.
Yeah.
I remember you saying that like Halloween 2 just feels like a remake of Halloween, basically. Yeah. And to be fair, they have created something different here. So I do kind of like the fact that it's not just a kind of boring retread. Yeah, I'm not wholly sold on it. How about you, Antonia?
Yeah, I feel the same. I think I would probably recommend it to certain friends, but not to everybody. I think it's tonally quite incoherent. I don't think it really knows what it's trying to do, apart from to make a lot of money and have as many people viewing it as possible, which clearly it didn't really succeed in that remit. I don't know. Yeah, I don't necessarily think it hangs together properly as a coherent piece of work.
Yeah,
I think it's weird, but it's not as kind of bogglingly weird as some of the other. Like if you compare it to sort of the Cronenberg films coming out around this time, it's clearly not as weird as Videodrome. So, there's nothing in this film that you can think, what on earth, who thought of that? Yeah, that's a really out there idea. Yeah. Or say, even some Japanese, this must be around the same time or a few years before Tetsu Iron Man, for instance, which is a film that you watch it, think, oh, what the hell is going on, and where's this come from, and you get a jaw dropping in places.
Well, that's interesting, because I don't think it's trying to be weird. I think it is trying to have kind of this sort of clarity of purpose. These are cannibals; they are going around killing, people in the state of Texas and trying not to get caught.
Yeah, you're right. And it doesn't feel weird in the way, say, Halloween 3 is a pretty weird film, but that's because so many different people worked on the screenplays. You've got like Nigel Neal's stuff in there with like the Stone Circle, the Stonehenge stuff, the energy being tapped from Stonehenge, and then you've got the sort of really horrible stuff with the kids turning into insects and snakes and all, and that film's weird because it clearly had. You can tell that it's a script that's just been cobbled together. Whereas this doesn't feel like that. You can tell that the script's been written by the same people, but it feels like they're trying to address to.
Yeah. I think at heart, Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise is about a man who just wants to make really good chili.
Yeah. Possibly it shouldn't have even been a franchise. That's the thing, because it's 13 years after, and this has been made to make money, whereas the original one wasn't. I'm guessing it was just they wanted to make a low budget horror film to scare people and hopefully make some money. And it's interesting you said that, because Cannon wanted this film under 100 minutes, and the sole purpose was so that they could get more screenings a day to make more money. They've said that. But the first film, I think, is only about 80 minutes anyway.
It's really tight, yeah.
And that's why it does get time to get boring. I wouldn't use the word boring for this, but it could be, I don't know, the time could have been spent, more could be going on in certain bits. And I think it's a shame, because I get this with a few films. I remember the opening scenes more than I do the end. And surely, unless it's that perfect scene setter, you should remember the end of the film more. Possibly, because that's meant to be the conclusion, almost I think at the end of a film, like if you look at something like, commercially, like Ghostbusters, you remember the big sort of fight at the end. One thing I did meant to mention when we were talking about Caroline Williams is when she went for her audition, lots of people went for the role. It was Tobe Hooper and Carson, the two writers who were doing the auditions, and she ran screaming into the room they were in, down a corridor to get there. Got the chairs in the room and just put it to shut the door so no one could come in, and just went mad. And she's good at that sort of thing. It's kind of, in the first film, I don't know the actress name, I should have looked it up. She's brilliant at just being scared and the intense screaming, and a lot of that's the way it's shot, I suppose. But in this, I think you see that she's scared, but you also see that element that she's going to be, or could be, the hero in the film as well.
Yeah, she has that sort of defiance about her.
Yeah, and I think it's a shame she didn't go on to do more. She's definitely the strongest, or one of the strongest things about the film. The guy who plays Leatherface, I don't think does too good a job. The original actor wanted more money, basically, and they were like, well, no one knows who you are, so they got somebody else. And the guy they got, I think the only thing I recognised he was in was DOA, a Dennis Quaid thriller made around the same time, which is probably quite forgotten now.
Probably a remake. I think it's probably a remake of the old film noir.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And that was another flop. So yeah, I mean, cast-wise, I think the main actress, Caroline Williams, is really good. Dennis Hopper's there for a paycheck and for a name. I mean, even though his career kind of declined at this point, it's still Dennis Hopper, isn't it? And I think did I mention that he said this was his worst film until he made Super Mario Brothers, which is another film I focused on here, and I showed it to a young lad who had never seen it, and he loved it. Now I thought he'd hate it. Whereas with this, I think a younger generation who maybe haven't grown up with the original as much as we have might appreciate this a bit more. Do you reckon?
Maybe. I think my students would probably enjoy this, or might enjoy it more than the first film, because it's less. The first film was a very uncomfortable watch, and I think they do struggle with kind of discomfort and unease, whereas they can cope with irony and kind of memeable moments. And I think this film is definitely better internet bait than the first film. Yeah,
it's. I'd describe it as a more fun film than and more enjoyable in many ways, but it's certainly not a better film. But it's a hell of a lot better than some of the sequels. The one after Leatherface, the third film, is just, it tries to be dark like the original, but it's shot in that almost 90s TV movie style. And obviously this is the same people behind it as the original, which, if I didn't know that, I might think it's a different director. If I hadn't seen, Invaders from Mars and a lot of his other stuff, he's clearly developed a lot as a director, for good or bad, since making the first movie.
Yeah.
And I think that the success of the first one, it would have been very difficult to go back and do a sequel in the same vein. It's kind of why they didn't with Blair Witch in the 90s, I'm guessing. Because it's been done and they don't need the low budget for it.
But again, Blair Witch is definitely one of those other kind of horror classics that, and another one which is almost, it's one that often my students aren't very impressed by and are very dismissive of Blair Witch, but that's, just because I think there have been so many films which have imitated it. But, I think Blair Witch works wonderfully as a standalone film. Probably didn't really need any sequels.
And they're not memorable either, and but yeah, I really liked Blair Witch, and it was that I was at that age when it came out. The whole the internet was what sold that film when the internet was still quite young, and I think with the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it was word of mouth, and for us, maybe Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because we can remember it being banned, still seems that
the illicit.
Whereas younger listeners have always been able to watch it, and they might even be like, well, what's all the fuss about? Which I was kind of like scare-wise with Exorcist when I first saw it, but I did see it was well made and moment shocking. It was quite slow, but as an adult I prefer it for that. It's got one of them things called a plot, which is probably what this film is missing a bit. So I mean, I mentioned that as well because I looked at the stats for our other shows, and the average listener is between 18 and 24 who've been listening to this. So whatever age you are, if you listened, please get in contact on the Facebook page, on the Anchor page, if you can, through Spotify. I'm not sure, but let us know what you think if you've seen the film, if you disagree with us, if you agree with us, or any other film suggestions. It's kind of films I've grown up liking, but you might remind me of a film that I do really like, and I'm getting old now, so I don't remember all these things. But I am just to sort of summarise. I did do the cheesy. Firstly, do you think it should have been a hit?
No. I mean, I think it could. Maybe it deserves to do a bit better, but I don't think it shouldn't be remembered on the same level as the first film.
No,
I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah. I think it's remembered for different reasons.
Yeah.
Not necessarily all negative, and I do think the reviews were quite harsh, but it did make money, and Canon were all about that. I'm going to do it. Ratings out of 10, Antonia.
4.5.
4.5. That's nearly half.
I was going Yeah, around the same. I'll say 5.
5. Okay.
Ooh, average score.
Average. Yeah. I'd give it an 8, obviously, because of the gore. One quickly we'll mention that it's got sort of an almost pop rock soundtrack, which is so different from the original. I don't know if that worked for it or not, but then it's set around a radio DJ, so they probably had to do that.
Yeah, I was glad to hear Oingo Boingo, Tony Alfredman's band, cropping up. No One Lives Forever, near the start of the film, which is a great track.
Yeah, and this would have been just before his career sort of scoring films took off.
Yeah, I guess, like some of the Big Burton collaborations.
Yeah, it's the same year as Beetlejuice, year after, or 2 years after Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
Yeah, and not that long before he would have composed the Simpsons theme tune.
Oh yeah, I always forget he does that because it sounds different to all these other. While we mentioned him, we might as well go off topic a bit. Have you seen the Forbidden Zone, the film?
Yes, I have when I was a teenager.
Thoughts on that one?
A lot. I'd probably find it unwatchably problematic now, if I'm honest. I think as a 33-year-old, I would struggle watching the amount of blackface in that film that didn't really bother me as much as a teenager. I mean, even as a teenager, I thought, it's a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
I think I'd find it a bit juvenile now, even though I do like all the kind of German expressionist kind of set design going on, all the kind of cardboard sets and things. Yeah. But I suspect I wouldn't like it that much now.
I haven't seen it for years, and I thought it's kind of forgotten about now, and you've just explained why it's never mentioned anymore, which I'd forgotten about that. Thanks a lot for joining us. Me, not us. I'm not a collective yet. Who knows? I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and I hope everyone's enjoyed listening. Hopefully, I'll have another show next week. I don't know the film yet because I haven't got a clue. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks, Andy.